So as you can see, we are continuing in our new series entitled Life Discipleship. Jesus' method is our model. And I told you last week that what we're doing is we are looking at how Jesus actually discipled. And last week we saw that one thing that he did was he actually invited 12 men into a small group. And in this small group, Jesus was going to disciple them in a very intentional kind of way. And folks, what we see there is a model to follow for discipleship. The first thing we looked at was that he was teaching them doctrine. He was teaching them the things they needed to know about doctrine and about ministry. And he did it in two ways. He did it through life modeling. In other words, he allowed the small group to see him do ministry, the 12 apostles, and then he taught them in lessons. He would teach like the crowds, the parables, and then when he got his small group together, he would explain to them what the parables meant. Well, learning in a small group is a very important thing, but learning is not the only thing. We need to live out what we have learned. And what Pastor Darren and the rest of the pastors, what we've been talking about and we're implementing, is a very intentional approach to our small groups so that these adult small groups are discipling the way Jesus discipled, the way that Jesus' disciples, the apostles, wound up structuring in many ways the early church, and discipleship continued then. And we want to follow that in a very intentional way. Now, I'm a simple guy, so I need certain reminders, and the reminder for me is the word life. It's an acrostic that we're using. And the L, as I've already said, it represents learning leaders. These are what we traditionally call teachers. And I tell you what, our church's history of small groups here, at least in the past several decades, has been wonderful. And our teachers have done a great job. We want them to keep on doing what they're doing. And a lot of small groups are doing everything that we're going to be talking about in this series, but we're wanting to do it with intentionality, and we're wanting to add some formal leadership to our small groups so that those teachers, those learning leaders, don't feel that they've got to lead the small group in all of these areas. Also, it sets up lines of communication between the central office and the pastors and the small group leaders and all the small groups themselves. So learning is still very critical. But as I said last week, from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, there's three other routines or three other activities of discipleship. The second one that we're going to look at today is interceding. And we're going to see that we need to intercede in two ways, spiritually and physically. And then next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at fellowship. And the week after that, we're going to look at engagement. But what I want you to understand is each one of these letters in our life discipleship small group ministry, they represent leaders in the classroom or in the small group that will be in charge or intentionally focused leading the class in these four areas. So I want you to see from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, the idea in verse 42 and 45 that there was intercession taking place. In verse 42, it says, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and notice that last phrase, and in prayers. The early church was a praying church, and they were praying for each other, they were praying for the kingdom, they were praying for the neighbors and all that, but they were praying for each other, and our small groups is the best place to learn what to pray for one another. But then notice it wasn't just prayers. In verse 45, it says, and they sold their possessions and goods and divided among them all as anyone had need. And they were helping each other, not just spiritually with prayer, but physically with physical needs. Sometimes they were monetary needs. Sometimes they were, protection. Sometimes there was just physical need for supplies. And the apostles helped the early church see this. Why? Because Jesus had shown them this model in his small group of the apostles. Now, before we get into our primary text, I want to show you how Jesus interceded and taught them to intercede. For instance, interceding spiritually in prayer. In John 17, toward the end of his earthly ministry, Jesus had the disciples in the upper room. In what is known as the great high priestly prayer, Jesus prayed for his disciples. He was praying that the Father would be with them, protect them, guide them, strengthen them. He was praying for them. And just a little while later, Jesus took the disciples into the Garden of Gethsemane where he asked them to begin to pray. Pray for yourselves, but also he shared with them the struggle he was facing, knowing that they would watch and pray with him. So he taught them, I'm going to pray for you. You pray for me. That's spiritual intercession. But we also see in the Gospels how Jesus interceded physically for his disciples. For instance, we see in Mark chapter 4 how Jesus and the disciples were in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee when a storm rushed over the hillside there, and Jesus was asleep. The disciples were terrified, and they cried out to him, and Jesus stood up and protected them. You remember how he did it? He spoke, and the sea and the storm was calm. But it wasn't just physically protecting them. He also financially helped. There's an account where the religious leaders were confronting some of Jesus' disciples, and Peter came to Jesus and said, they're saying we're not paying the temple tax. And you remember what Jesus said to Peter? He said, you go catch a fish and take a coin out of its mouth, and you go pay my temple tax, and Peter, you pay yours as well. There's enough there for you. So he's providing him monetarily so that they would not be an offense to the crowd there in Jerusalem. But then we also see at other times where Jesus actually on the seashore, he was cooking breakfast for his disciples. Why? Because he was providing for them sustenance after a long night of fishing that they had been doing. And I want you to see, Jesus didn't just pray for his disciples in his small group. Jesus ministered physically to them. And then the apostles, when they became the leaders of the early church, they taught the church. We don't just get together to learn. Something else we do is we intercede for one another. We help each other spiritually, and we help each other physically. And that's a part of being a disciple. And that's why we want to make sure with intentionality that our small groups are not just learning, but they are interceding. So today what I want us to do is look at a text from Acts chapter 12. The early church interceding well in many ways. And it actually is a great example for us how our small group should be interceding for one another. So it's in Acts chapter 12. We learned, first of all, that Jesus' followers experience issues. And we're going to look just for a few minutes at verse 5 only to begin with. Acts chapter 12, verse 5. It says, Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. Peter had an issue. Anybody detect what that issue was? He was in prison. Yes, he was. That's an issue. That's an issue I've never had. That's an issue that for the cause of the gospel, many of you probably have never had. Now, a few of you all may went to jail when you were young, you got into trouble, that kind of stuff. We're not talking about that, okay? Peter was not in prison because he'd done anything wrong. Peter was in prison because he had done what was right, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it got him in trouble with the local officials, and they threw him in jail. Now, who was the local official? If you go back and read verses 1 through 4, you'll learn that the local official was King Herod Agrippa I. Now, this is the grandson of Herod the Great, who was the king when Jesus was born. Now, his grandson, King Herod Agrippa, what we read in those first 4 verses is that he had arrested the apostle James. And he had James run through with the sword. He executed James. Now, the religious leaders and the religious traditionalists of Israel loved it. They were like, yes, I tell you what, this Jesus thing's got to stop. And if we have to stop his apostles, we're going to stop it. So they were cheering Herod Agrippa on. So you know what a good politician does when they're being cheered by the crowds? More of the same thing, right? So what Herod Agrippa did was he had Peter arrested next. And Peter, it was a holiday, so he couldn't have him executed on the holiday. So what is he doing? He's waiting for the holiday to be over, and pretty much everybody knew Peter's toast when the holiday is over. Now that is the issue that Peter found himself in when he was in prison. Now, who knows what the future may hold? Some of us may be in prison someday. But probably up to this point, we've not had an issue like that, but every one of you have had issues. Because when you gave your life to Jesus by faith, there was no doctrinal statement that said, now that you're saved, all problems are gone. In fact, Jesus said, you're going to have some new problems that the rest of the world's not going to have. Because the world hates me, they're going to hate you. They're going to persecute you because of me. So we even got new problems upon top of all of the regular problems. And that's what we're learning here. The first thing I want us to think about from verse 5 is that small group members will experience issues outside the church. You're probably not going to go to jail, though, who knows? But you got your own set of your own set of life problems and issues. Now, what are the areas in which most Christians have problems? Well, sometimes they happen in their homes. Any of y'all had problems in the home? You know, just because you're a Christian and saved doesn't mean, let's say, that a husband and wife, Christian husband and wife, don't get at odds with one another every once in a while. Amen? That was really weak. You're all sucking up to each other, right? I get it. Yeah. No, sometimes even Christian husbands and wives have issues with one another. Or Christian parents have issues with their children, whether they're young or whether they're old. Because Christians aren't promised an easy life once they're saved. Christians have issues. And it's not just in the home. Sometimes it's extended family. Any of y'all have extended family issues? Sometimes it may be, your aging parents. Sometimes it may be your grown siblings. Sometimes it may be your aunts and uncles and cousins and nieces and nephews. It seems like as families are aging, that more and more issues begin to crop up among extended family members. Some of you may have issues in your workplace. Maybe you're the boss or you're a manager and you got some employees you're going to have to deal with tomorrow morning. Maybe you're the employee and you're really irritated at your boss or your manager. Maybe on Friday before work was over, you and some fellow employees had it out with each other. That's real world, even for Christians. Christians have issues. And we see issues all the time. Maybe it's with your neighbors. Maybe you got a neighbor that at 11 o'clock they come alive and they start cranking their radio outside in the backyard. You got neighbors like that? I had a neighbor one time that I'm almost certain was a drug dealer. Across the street from me, all hours of the night, cars go in, 2 minutes later, cars go out. Next minute, 2 cars go in, then they go out, and they go back and forth like that. I'm almost sure he was a drug dealer. Some of you all maybe loan tools and other things to your neighbors, and they never return them, and it really is starting to irritate you. And Christians have issues. Sometimes Christians have their children in their teen years that get into legal problems, maybe tax problems. Maybe you feel like the government's trying to force you to do something you shouldn't do, and that's a government problem. Christians have issues. We shouldn't be surprised. Peter had an issue, but Peter is not the only saint of the Bible who had an issue. We can go into the Old Testament and the New Testament. We see all the time saints had issues. There was one guy who had family issues, unlike any family issues I've ever had. His name was Joseph. Y'all remember those family issues he had? Yeah, Joseph had issues with his grown brothers because they sold him into slavery. I don't know about you. I never had that experience. But that was family issues. Elijah had political issues. He had government issues. He had even emotional issues. Elijah was on the top of Mount Carmel there, and he called down fire to consume the altar after the prophets of Baal had been praying and begging Baal forever. And then all 500 prophets of Baal were destroyed because God had revealed himself. Man, you talk about a mountaintop experience. But Queen Jezebel, who supported those 500 prophets of Baal, she committed, I'm getting you, Elijah. And there was a chase on. And Elijah took off running, and he was really struggling. And once he finally stopped running, he cried out to God. He was like, God, how am I going to, just take me. How am I going to deal with all this? Why? Because emotionally he was having issues, thinking he was the only one who was having issues. And yet God let him know there's 7,000 that didn't bow the knee to Baal. But even prophets sometimes have those emotional issues. Saints have issues. Let's take, for instance, David. He had political issues when King Saul was chasing to kill him. Let's think about Jesus' disciples. Jesus' disciples had church issues. Wait a minute, you can have church issues? Sure, you can have church issues. You remember when James and John came to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, when you enter into your kingdom, will you let me and my brother sit on the right and left-hand side of you? I don't care which side we're on, just doesn't matter. Just let us sit there. Now, what the other disciples think in small group when they found out that 2 of them had gone behind their back trying to get the key positions in the kingdom of God? What the other small group members think? How dare you? I can't believe you would do this to me. All the while thinking, man, I should have done that. I hadn't thought about that. But they had church issues. They had small group issues. Even the Son of God himself had issues. He had issues with the political leaders of the day. He had issues with the religious leaders of the day. Just take a moment and look around the people around you right now. Look around. What's their issue? They got an issue. What's their issue? We see the thing is in a large group environment like this, most of you aren't going to be so bold as to say, what's your issue? You want to talk to me? Let's open up. Let's have a counseling session right here. No, that's not a large group environment kind of activity. Where do you find out about your fellow church members' issues? It's usually in small group. And lots of times it's not when you first join a small group because you don't know who these people are. It's when you go to small group consistently over time. And you're not just coming on Sunday morning for an hour where somebody's up there lecturing, and it's all information. It's when you go to the fellowships. It's when you go to the funeral home or to the hospital when a baby's been born or somebody is sick. It's when you go out and you go on a local mission trip together. It's when you spend time together, working together, loving on each other in times of need and celebration. Over time, if you are participating in a small group the way that Jesus' disciples participated in their small group, over time, you are going to start caring for them. Now, yes, sometimes they're going to irritate the soup out of you, all right? I get that. Just like the disciples got irritated with one another and Jesus got irritated with the disciples. Because when you're in a group, and I mean you're really invested into the group, you see the good, and the really ugly. Yeah, you see every bit of the people in your small group, but it's sort of like at home. You see the good, the bad, and the ugly in your home, don't you? And you love them all the more. When you spend time with people in your small group, you see some things you don't necessarily like, but you love them. That was Jesus' method. That was the method that the disciples set up for the early church. Because everybody in church has issues. And the best place to be helped with our issues is in a small group environment. And that leads us to the second thing. Small group members must intercede for issues inside the church. When our members outside are having issues, when they come into the church, that's when, as the early church, we need to be in constant prayer for our fellow church members. Just the way the early church was in constant prayer for Peter as he was dealing with his issues. See, here's the thing. Jesus knew his disciples were going to have issues, but Jesus never intended his disciples to deal with their issues alone. Jesus intended for us to have loving relationships where we can help each other with our issues. And the sanctuary is not the place to get to know people and their issues. It's in the small groups. That's Jesus' method. We see it in the gospel. We see it in the early church. And we need to let Jesus' method be our model of discipleship. So the first thing, Jesus' followers experience issues. The church is there to help each other through the issues. How do we do this? That's the second part I want us to see in Acts chapter 12. Jesus' followers practice intercession. Verses 12 through 17. So when he, and that's Peter, when Peter had considered this, Peter came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, "You are beside yourself." Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, "It's his angel." Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw Peter, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hands to keep silent, then Peter declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And Peter said, "Now go tell these things to James and to the brethren. And then Peter departed and went to another place. Now, what I think we see in these verses right here is intercession in its twofold manifestations. The two ways that Christians are to intercede for one another. And what we see is it taking place in a small group the way it works best throughout the centuries. Two different examples of intercession. And it is sort of a humorous account when you start thinking about everything that was transpiring here. You see, in verses 6 through 11, I didn't read it for you, but in verses 6 through 11, remember verse 5, the church is praying for Peter. Verses 6 through 11, God heard and intervened. How did he do it? He sent an angel. Now, when the angel came, the angels just sort of appeared in the prison where Peter was. And what we understand was there's layers of security in this particular prison. But the angels just intervened, and nobody apparently saw the angel. Now, Peter was asleep. Now, how do you think an angel would approach a sleeping saint? Peter, Peter. You know, those angelic voices, right? Mine sound more like raspy, just woke up from sleep voice, but nonetheless, you get the point. But that's not what the angel did. What did the angel do? We read in the text, poked him in the side. Wake up, Peter. Has your spouse ever poked you in the morning to wake you up? My spouse has never done that, but it would be very irritating if she did. That's what the angel did. Poked him in the side, said, wake up, Peter, put your coat on, put your shoes on. And that's exactly what Peter did. And then the angel said, now follow me. And they went through layer after layer of security, got to the outer layer of security, which was a gate, a steel gate. And Peter said it just sort of opened up. Movies, it's always got a creak, right? And they walked out. And then it says, and then when they were out in the street, poof, the angel disappeared. Now, where is Peter at this moment? He is on the outside of a prison gate where he had been a prisoner. He's in the street now all by himself. He thought it was a dream. In the street, he realized this is no dream at all. What do you do when you're on the outside of a prison that you just escaped? Run. Exactly. And that's apparently what Peter did. He ran. Now, where do you run? Where do you run? To whom do you run? You run to the people that you know care for you. You run to the people that you know will help you in your greatest time of need. And where did Peter run at this moment? That's in verse 12. He ran to the house of Mary. This is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is not Mary Magdalene. This is Mary, the mother of John Mark. Later on in Acts, we read where John Mark is sort of the issue between Barnabas and Paul, that they get irritated with each other. Well, this is John Mark's mama's house. And I want us to learn from verse 12 a very important type of intercession small groups do. Small groups must intercede spiritually. Look again at verse 12. So Peter came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together, doing what? Praying. And folks, I guarantee you they were praying for Peter. Why did Peter go to Mary's house, John Mark's house? And I think there's a hint in here because he had been there before and he'd been there frequently. You say, well, where is that hint? Look a little bit after he's knocking on the gate. There's this girl who comes forward and she hears his voice. Notice verse 13. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. And verse 14, what did she do? She recognized Peter's voice. How did she recognize Peter's voice? You recognize a voice when you've heard it a lot, right? Now, maybe she recognized because she heard Peter preaching out in the temple courtyard. Or maybe she'd heard Peter's voice there at her mistress's house. Because the word girl there in the Greek means a young servant girl. See, here's a young servant girl. She's sort of on the periphery of society, and yet she has been around Peter enough that she recognized Peter simply by the sound of his voice. She didn't open the gate. She didn't see Peter. The gate must be solid. She heard Peter, and that's all she needed to know. Hey, that's Peter. Now, how did she recognize it? Because I think Peter was at this house quite often. I think there was a small group that was at this house quite often, and Peter was there with them. And that's how Rhoda recognized Peter, by his voice. Folks, what we see here is probably a regular gathering of a small group, and Peter was involved in this small group quite regularly. And that is how Peter and the other apostles organized the church. Large group in the temple courtyard, Solomon's colonnade. Small group in the homes, house to house. And one of the things the small group did was when they knew of issues in their small group members' lives, they prayed for them. Not just before a Bible lesson on Sunday morning, but they prayed passionately for them. Why? Because they knew the issues. Now, when you pray for people in your small group, then you need to pray expectantly. Because that is not the way that they were praying in this day, sadly enough. Because I want you to notice when Peter was knocking and Rhoda heard his voice, she went back in verse 14, back into the prayer meeting and said, "Peter's at the gate, Peter's at the gate." Now I'm thinking in my mind, Rhoda, why did you not open the gate for Peter? I mean, Peter just, what happened? He just escaped from jail. I think that he would like to be on the inside of the gate unseen rather than on the outside in the street in case the guards come running down the street. But Rhoda was so excited that she forgot to open up the gate. A little humor even right there. But when she went into the prayer meeting and said, "Peter's at the gate, Peter's at the gate," what did they say to her? They said, "You are beside yourself." Now, I don't say that very often in my vernacular language. How would you say what they meant? You're crazy, exactly. As I said to the previous service, you're all really good at your Greek. I'm impressed. All right? You're crazy. And Rhoda's like, no, I'm telling you the truth. This is what I heard. It was Peter at the gate. And then they said, notice in verse 15, they said, well, it was his angel. Now, what do they mean by the angel? Now, some scholars believe that the angel is the Jewish tradition that every believer, every child of God has a guardian angel. I've even heard, even to this day in churches, people think every person who's a Christian has a guardian angel. I don't know. Some people thought that. Maybe they thought that Peter had been executed. And therefore, it was actually a message from Peter's spirit to let us know, hey, I've been executed, I'm going on. We don't know what they meant. But what we do know is what they expected. Or in this case, did not expect. What did they not expect at their prayer meeting? They didn't expect Peter to show up. See, lots of times we will pray for one another, but we pray unexpectedly. And what we see right here is that we need to pray expectantly. Folks, we worship the God. He can do whatever he wants. He can even send an angel into the heart of a prison and bring out one of his own when they are about to be unjustly executed. He can do that if he so chooses. And yet we also see that as saints that we ought to understand that God doesn't promise he'll always do that. Because, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there were different times when they were thrown into certain situations. And I remember the three friends one time said, whether he rescues us from the fiery furnace or not, it doesn't matter. We're not going to bow down. So you go into life, whether God is going to rescue me from the most difficult circumstances in life or not, it doesn't matter. I'm going to continue to obey and worship God. And in this instance, just like the four Hebrew boys, in this instance, God did rescue. But the small group members were not quite expectant of this kind of supernatural intervention. Folks, we need to be praying for one another. And it is in the small group environment where we find out the needs of one another. I've always had this issue arise in every church I've been in. I'll have a church member that goes through a difficult situation in life, and they will come and say, I don't understand why the church didn't support me in it. And there's been times I've said, you mean even your small group didn't support you in that? Oh, no, I don't go to a small group. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that's probably the first issue right there. It's because the church doesn't know your issues in large group. It's in the small group where the issues are known, where the intercession takes place. The spiritual intercession of prayer, but also the spiritual intercession a physical aid. That's the second thing I want us to see. Small groups must intercede physically. Look at verse 16. It says, now Peter continued knocking. I love that. You know, can you envision this in your mind? He comes to the door, real quiet, and the servant girl hears and comes up and she says, yes, it's Peter. Ah! And she runs away. And he's like, now while she's in there, she's saying, it's Peter. And they're like, no, it's not, you're crazy. It's Peter. It's his angel. It's his spirit. And no, it's Peter. And then they hear him pounding on the gate outside. And they all come. And I want you to notice that when he continued knocking and when they finally opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. I mean, shocked. Because they hadn't expected Peter to be released from prison. I don't know what they were praying. Maybe they were praying, Lord, he's going to die anyway. Just make it quick and easy for him. Yeah. I'm not sure what they were praying, but they didn't expect Peter to show up that night. But then what it says in the first part of verse 17 is that Peter sort of silenced everybody because everybody's sort of freaking out, coming up, hugging him, whatever. Hey, what? And he explained to them how he got rescued. And look at the last part of verse 17. And Peter said, go, tell these things to James and to the brethren. And I want you to notice he made a request, a physical request of the people in that small group. And I want you to notice he made the request even though they were in the middle of a small group session. They were in the middle of a prayer meeting. It was late at night and the streets were dark, and he had the audacity to say, I need you all to go right now and tell James, which would be the half-brother of Jesus, and the rest of those leaders, tell them that I have escaped. Now let me ask you the question. Why didn't Peter go tell them? Why didn't Peter tell them? He's on the run. Exactly. Very smart young lady up here. He's on the run, so he needs the help of his small group. And it was, yes, it was messing with their small group gathering for the month. Well, if we do this, then we're going to have to, 2 weeks from now, have another small group gathering because we spent our time helping Peter out physically. And this, it doesn't matter. It's life. And when the needs arise, the small group was ready to meet the need because he was on the run and he had to get to another place, the text says. So in the middle of the night, here goes small group members out. And the question is, where are these guys? I don't know. So they're going from house to house where they've heard that these guys may be in order to let them know, Peter escaped. And he wants you to know he's going to another place. See, that's what small groups do. Why did Peter go here to Mary's house instead of going to James's house or one of the other leaders' houses? Well, once it's discovered that he's escaped from jail, where's the first thing the officials are going to go? They're going to go to the apostles. Is he here? No. So he went to the place that he knew he was loved and he knew they would help. And they were helping as best as they could, praying for him. But then he asked them for additional help. And the additional help they were willing to give. That's how small groups work. And we see it time and time in the Bible, starting with Jesus' own ministry. As we saw last week, he invited 12 into his small group. We don't know how many's in this small group that the apostles taught the church and the church were doing well, but it's small group. Now, this whole series is to show you the importance of small group ministry. So important that we want to structure our small groups with that acrostic life. We want the learning to continue, but we also want a leader designated to make sure that the group is interceding spiritually in prayer and interceding physically. In the prayer, what we hope will be set up are prayer chains. So that leader hears about a need, that leader calls somebody or texts somebody who calls somebody, texts somebody who calls somebody, texts somebody. That leader also, hopefully on a physical level, can set up a meal train so that if somebody's in the hospital and when they come home, that we can have a schedule of meals going to them because we're Baptists and we eat, even when we're sick, we eat, right? So we need the meal train. We need the meals continuing to go. But also what I call a band-aid. It's not a band-aid like you put on your finger. It's a band of small group members who are aiding physically in other areas besides food. And what we're hoping is that we can intentionally organize our small groups so that we, like the early church, like the apostles, like Jesus taught them, so that we intercede for one another.